Hello, America, and Fox News, and Judge Napolitano. I should have put Judge Napolitano. But in other words, there are people with Massachusetts through administration since I was a kid tied to Mike Roberts, who other people from other areas report. Like there's a these are people that were from other areas, roles with predicate acts years ago on my street. Has something to do with their roles planting evidences of acting tied to and as collusion slash S with people with predicate acts with databases. Increasingly, there are proofs that, the programs where they have the natures of industry and natures of negotiations, it is entertaining and has entertaining what can't entertain itself without self valuing collusion slash S with the real causes of negative value nature progressions, acts, and natures at all locations, areas, and states being and having been blamed on other things, others themselves. So increasingly, there are Connecticut police departments and retired police chiefs from Wethersfield involved with the same houses personally and professionally, with them switching and forging names and making confessions and stacking predicate acts in databases as timed collusions with a whole bunch of different countries. Not legit. This is also where and how they confess and demonstrate, even where and how they don't want to, not just to me, but to other countries, and not just to other countries. Because to the breaching method that keeps other countries and keeps our country blaming other things, others ourselves, for what the breaching method that's not A through Z keeps A through Z blaming other things, others ourselves, for what it caused and keeps. Otherwise, that body is sensed and that is adapted to, including if it is a majority of people, that body, including if it is everyone of an entire country together. And any groupings of countries, while it's still entertaining locations, areas, and states, fact, attribute, nature, quality, aspects, and nature, as is standing, it can't defend that and afford to be, let alone to protract. Short words with convictions proper, let alone with blame, let alone with blame and passions and emotions, or calmness forbidding passions and emotions. Passions and emotions are about the simultaneous slash hyper simultaneous. This breaching method showed the branches of government associated with which trials were, they still are associated with which trials are about, blaming other things, others ourselves, for what honest scientific examination of what witch trials are about. There's a witch trials place next to Webb House, renamed the Webb Stevens Museum at, at Wethersfield, Connecticut, Wethersfield slash Hartford, where Wethersfield was founded like before America's founders were born. No, and there was slavery entrenched northern colonies, southern colonies. See, this breaching method, the ancients would have discerned before the sciences became criminally foreign influenced. They would have discerned how there's the difference between, positive and negative treatments. And like with courage, there has not, in other words, the treatments of courage are criminal insidious natures of courage regarding Boston history, Massachusetts history, and roles of the American Revolution. Like, for example, that's one of the positives that are collusions with the overt negatives caused by the breaching method that everyone has roles with simultaneously, keeping from discernment, which means keeping its identity relativity to criminal insidiousness natures of positive treatments and negative treatments as syntactically appreciated. In other words, keeping that sabotaged, keeping it collusion slash S, also for hyper additional apparent and real motivations, natures, needs, and interests that can't be defended and afford to have discerned. Use of all location slash S. Forgiveness is important because to discern the breaching method and what witch trials are about, even if they were made up, the slavery method against everyone sickly, distinctly, northern colonies, southern colonies, and with black, against black, sickly, distinctly, but northern colonies and southern colonies non-distinctly too. It was entrenched before America's founders were born, with all kinds of other things to keep everyone measured and maintained without free speech and pretending other, that's also forced by the breaching method. Otherwise, that body would be sensed, including if that body was a majority of people, including if it was everyone from any modern country. We are in a semi-ancient trap that forced, tricked, hurt, and persuaded the bodies of the human species body of individual bodies, increasingly used as systems tactical ulterior from nature where it has assignments and communications, as demonstrated to us as with A through Z differences, therefore names, and hyper additionally ground location /S. There are houses built before America's founders were born, and there were terror, extortion, and torture, and slavery laws, and worse, against everyone with internationally monitored conversations regarding, and like I learned at notes at Central Connecticut State University, there were internationally monitored conversations, and they would hurt anyone even found out, and everyone around the people who heard people speaking about internationally monitored conversations. I mean, about who heard people speaking about building infrastructure outside of internationally monitored conversation. And James Madison's plan was already unfolding where they were counter-extorting at key locations. The rest, the final third of America's founders. Nature itself and our founders communicated with President/Chief that Native Americans are 1/3 of America's founders, as those that wanted those means, defended as the Constitution unabridged, and hyper additionally where and how we have rights that are too numerous to have to list them, relative to also uses of questions by states on criminally foreign influence, tactically delusions raw, as collusion /S2, where there are certain type of victim /hyper victim. But this breaching method has all A through Z, victim /hyper victim. And if anyone tries to make treatments of that relative like to the Black people's way to life, everyone's a victim of that, hyper victim. But when we try to appreciate it that way, relative to the breaching method that has forced roles with that, no one wanted. People sense their needs with self-valued already with syntax since they were kids, having been collusion against themselves and others, and the difference of that, blaming other things, others, ourselves for what nature itself, and for what James Madison and our founders communicated for us to blame on the human fact treatment nature breaching method. And they declassified how they did not have free speech, how everyone's voice, and how everyone had to pretend otherwise to be sensed by the breaching method, the human fact treatment nature breaching method, therefore physical, entrenched, again, northern colonies and southern colonies that were criminally foreign influence /hyper criminally foreign influence, possessions of other countries and companies, themselves being and having been used remotely as possession /hyper possession /hyper possessions of the human factory nature breaching method, that which we could call a hyper archetypal criminal enterprise. I'm not even a lawyer, thank God. That came from before modern religious messengers were born. The beginning of the Old Testament has a part, for example, per science alone. Because in other words, the beginning of the Old Testament has a part that says only defend right here, where the names of the people of the sciences will come together, and the part that comes before it. And this is a part in the Old Testament that comes before the story of Adam and Eve and the tree of the life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But people don't even know about that because they can't be honest about that right there. Because the names of the people of sciences are grouped by the identity that all things share, including the sciences. Where they appear not to share an identity comes with demonstrations, plural, of the same thing. slash S. It is how, in other words, that's what we are discerning. When we discern, we have two eyes. And fish and birds have two eyes. They have quality aspects in nature. They have a nature of consciousness, not just dogs. They have a nature of consciousness, distinct but non-distinct, and simultaneous, but also per that which is not us nor them, but is all things anyway. People say, oh God, this is per science. This is a distinct identity of hyper invisible, but still discernible. And this is how English was more probably having been revealed to be taught. The parts of speech are the invisible, but still discernible. And they have this hyper conjunction to themselves as a system that no one could change. We could ignore it and replace it, but no one could change it. And it will increasingly demonstrate with negative value nature progressions, acts, and natures that the hypernative system is abridged. And that's the value of the Constitution unabridged, and of how and of why we have rights that are too numerous to have to list them. So the difference between the criminal foreign influences of the branches of government, where and how that's what that's about, or the intelligence tied to them, criminally foreign influence / hyper criminally foreign influence, with witch trials. That's what that's about. That's what they're about. Changing black pupils' whites of eyes. What that communicates. That's what that's about. Forcing roles with that. It's about self-cultivation of roles propagated to maintain everyone's syntax, styles, and natures of it as criminal insidiousness nature / hyper criminal insidiousness nature. And that's not a formal term. Hyper criminal insidiousness nature. But nature itself shows us there was a distinct, that's one of the things that we could observe using science. For example, we have to appreciate the scientific value of the human fact shaping nature breaching method. That is one of the things that nature itself, but also that James Madison communicated, is of scientific value in the communications of James Madison. That scientific value, however, the human fact shaping nature breaching method, that is one of the things that is true always, what slavery was about. What James Madison communicated about that, the breaching method itself is separated and replaced inside the communications of James Madison. The breaching method measured and maintained certain type of victim / hyper victim as each age and member of each age and nature of humanity's volume science. Each member of it maintains self-valued roles, blaming other things, others, or selves for things that it demonstrates. And the things that nature demonstrates and that our founders demonstrated were about the human fact shaping nature breaching method. That's one of the things that caused the Declaration of Independence. And everyone to lie but pretend other still, like regarding what really entrenched slavery, northern colonies and southern colonies, and people able to get away with clearer than day, dishonestly pretending their opinions matter regarding the value of the discernment of how they had crazy laws against everyone sickly, distinctly northern colonies, southern colonies, and how those were monitored by internationally monitored conversations, and rolls with the slavery, and rolls with how sickly, distinctly slavery was entrenched northern colonies, southern colonies. And even though it was positive, it would have been positive to everyone at the time. And it still would be positive to everyone at the same time to address it, or for them to have addressed how sickly, non-distinctly, they were also all victims at the same time. They didn't do that because if they addressed that, if you examine the breaching method, had roles already having been sustained with natures of positive and negative treatments, with Boolean logic use slash S, as collusion slash S with itself, with all natures of crime scenes. When you're a breaching method that forces, rolls with those crazy laws sickly distinctly, in other words, it was through other countries' bodies, of individual bodies, of the individual human species body of individual bodies. No, because all group differences, plural, are with demonstration slash S of that generating all things, all group differences. We are not the only species body of individual bodies with all group differences. We are the only species body with criminal foreign influences, self-valuing roles with criminally foreign influence slash hypercriminally foreign influence systems for the tactical ulterior from nature's where it is also further positive onto itself and not as criminal insidiousness nature, because nature also values that we check that, we contemplate that. Nature didn't assign us to dictate to the people of New York City in those buildings stacked behind the people in rap videos to go get a job and work and go to schools that were and are collusion slash S with clearer than day. The names of the people of the sciences, individually grouped and together, incapable of affording to be, let alone to protract, short words with convictions proper regarding the science's lack of roles with the impositions upon every single individual of suburbs, let alone of suburban slash urban, let alone of straight up urban New York City. All exceptions, exception nature too. Those differences, the differences. That's why part of how we never address the differences in the natures of wealth and how that had and has roles with where America's founders had to start from nothing while still having to force other founders to help. We had Native Americans who can't help but be our founders and to sense for the human species body of individual bodies. In other words, it still has us employed, other than we are allowed to appreciate ourselves. Otherwise, we are not even allowed free speech, or they change and fake our words regarding black pupils and whites of eyes. Offensively in this country, and countries A through Z, where they use words like truths or lies, it is collusion slash S with where and how questions are used in the form of confessions too. Clearer than day. Kids from New York City, kids all over the country. But some ways or for example, next to New York City, in New Jersey. I fought at Trop World one time, a casino there, for a boxing tournament in New Jersey. And there were a lot of little religious spots, and there were a lot of what are those places? Were pawn shops involved with, a whole bunch of people in jail, a whole bunch of people hurt by the breaching methods employment slash S of everyone having countries A through Z at all locations, areas, and states, having to need food and water through systems tactically denatured, through systems pretending other for the breaching method or sensing for it if anyone addresses that. Black pupils. There are proofs that the famous American sentence, don't shoot until you see the whites of eyes. That also is cipher to be deciphered regarding the forced by the hyper criminally foreign influence breaching method that had multi-front uses of totally distinct nations, individually grouped in together roles with that, because they were enslaved by it themselves. They were tortured by it themselves and extorted by it themselves, three-way manifest. This breaching method, in some ancient times, it forced, tricked, hurt, and persuaded other things, others ourselves, to be blamed for things. So, and that to be defended. So that could hide increasingly itself because it knew it was going to get caught before it did. There are proofs for the only thing that could motivate anyone. And there are proofs that it figured out a way to trick the entire species body. No one could fathom a little criminal enterprise could force, trick, hurt, and persuade the entire species body to self-value roles and needs. And nature's used to force, systems tactical other than nature's self-value, while having been used remotely, criminally foreign influence, even though that hurts them and everyone around them. People are only taking instances treatments and names treatments and sense and sensibilities relativity to it. No, using Jane Austen's phrase, using Albert Einstein's too, though, no, relativity, but not the way he's using it. Using it, in other words, not the way she's using it, but also the ways they are using it. But see, everyone, but not entertaining, not leaving out how the breaching method is using. Jane Austen did not have free speech. And all exceptions and exception nature and nature debate regarding it. It contained and contains quality singular, / qualities, aspects in nature / natures, like criminal insidious natures, wrongdoers, plural, being generated from one. That same body generating demonstration / S to us. Not just about how it, to the extent we could discern, and which comes with its complete identity relationship to itself, and only increasing value of that. For example, how we could discern the value of how its identity relationship to itself, and the increasing value of that is why and how we have two eyes. Other species bodies do. There are 3 parts of time, bound, distinctly, non-distinctly, simultaneously / hyper simultaneously, that we know are true all ways as valued here now. Like seasons that aren't even here yet. Then there are 3 parts of time. There's a part of time from the past we know we don't know about. We know that. There's time now. To an extent, there's an extent we know that we don't know about. That comes with the extent we do know about. And the extent / S. And there's a part of time, as this, that we are discerning the body of time / forever nature. Where and how we discern the value of seasons that are not even here yet before they come. And that part of the body of that which is true always. And truth not being used for a lie, not being used as a criminal insidious nature of positive, as like a truth could be used for, or to screen a lie, or to screen a motivation. A breaching method is increasingly involved with the people's motivations regarding their syntax, regarding the validity of hyper-evidential right here with where and how we have Black people's whites of eyes, and this having been left out of subject treatments The breaching method employed black people's rights of eyes. Free speech about it prevented, and others with roles pretending other were forced to an extent slash s. Otherwise, that body would be sentenced, including if that body was a majority of people, including if that body was everybody. And that would be and is adapted to. Any grouping of countries that comes to counter that or what it causes and keeps also being and having been blamed on other things other than ourselves for the breaching method, but through ourselves, our own names at countries A through Z. It's like that movie. I never read the book, Lord of the Flies. In other words, but it's also like if that book or that movie had another layer to it, because this makes problems, outcomes, and resolutions where it had roles with all sides, and the location slash s involved. It had roles collusion slash s at all locations slash s everywhere the human species body was, and everywhere the species body is. It measures and maintains. It measured and maintained. The human factor be nature breaching method that is true always. For example, one of the things that all those crazy laws against everyone was about. See, when they speak about courage or cowardice, like where there's each state is sickly, distinctly, criminally foreign influence, tactically, delusions, raw. Collusion slash s. In other words, they can't defend that and afford discern. In other words, what's going on at each age of fact should be nature. Like regarding black people's whites of eyes. It's an insult to every body of the human species body to know that there's one black people labeled black with their skin too, not even black. They're just their pupils are. Their pupils are slandered. Their skin is slandered. Sickly distinctly. In other words, they were also white slaves. This is not to compare it like that and say, oh, listen, white people, and it's not to my white or black thing. There's a breaching method as a hyper additional name here. Therefore, color role, because it's not just the colors, because the roles were different. They were black and white, law natures, court natures, names internationally, collusion slash S with that, what slavery was about. Shock and awe with treatments of it as the transatlantic slave trade, international commerce, everyone leaving out the breaching methods roles with that, with having employed the human system, the human body of individual bodies, value slash value progression, inseparable, where it's simultaneously separable. So this is where and how it shows. That's why it's important to discern where and how we are not the body that invented how all the other species bodies have quality aspects of nature like humanity, distinctly but non-distinctly too, and simultaneously it began, but that they're hyper simultaneous, so to speak. In other words, so people are bringing up critical issues too against Native Americans, exactly the way the breaching method wanted and needs, to simultaneously make insidious positive unities with Native Americans and simultaneously insidious divisions as collusions, because it needs to keep its identity of relativity to ourselves. And every identity has relativity to positive and negative simultaneously. This is the phenomenon of how computers work, but they are abridgments of how nature appreciates this. These are they're evaluating. Each of the names of the people of the sciences came through campuses and that were already collusion slash S with all location slash S. And per this method that shows people, it sustained what it had to do to keep showing people that they need to hide live progression to other locations slash S. Hyper additionally, where everyone had collusion at all locations slash S. Otherwise, they were sentenced. And then hyper additionally, through our own, we are sentenced. And it's never stopped being time use / this of that. Differences they are recorded inter-branch, only capable of using their own physical and cultural and religious differences. Criminally foreign influence, tactically delusions raw. At the same time, with overt criminal enterprises, private ones, and terrorists. So it's relative to understand how at the beginning of the Old Testament it says, only defend right here with the names of the people of the sciences. No, it's speaking about sciences with the subject and the part that comes before it. And so then people want to have a nature debate. Well, it's your opinion that it matters what's in the other part of it. And they want it, in other words, well, they can't be asked about the other part of the book either, because that's about the knowledge of good and evil. And it's also about sequence shift. If you ignore the first part that says only defend right here. And it's also about, in other words, the difference between the parts that come after the first part of it, that the names of the people of the sciences and the experts on the religions can't be honest about, and the difference between that too, which also has relativity to where it is functional, where and how there are three grouped parts of the individual body of the hyper-simultaneous to the extent we could discern. We simultaneously discern how there's also part of itself that is not juxtaposed and will not juxtapose with the part, like the parts that we know, like the three parts of time that are grouped. In other words, and in other words, in that extent of the past that we know we'll never know about. And part of that, we know that we could learn about it just from what we do know. We are shown this by nature, because it is all bodies. It is all things. We could ignore its system, but it forces our special difference from here, from Earth's special difference, where we have this answer. Lethal ideas is forced space nature transfer, which is more probably, I never read this, but this is more probably what lethal ideas would have been described as being, is forced space nature transfer, and nature being the identity of all space / existence to the extent we could discern, which is why I'm using the word nature for identity instead of identity, because every identity has relativity to positive and negative simultaneously. Again, this breaching method is an identity of relativity as a thing too, as a value / value progression, because it is that way manifest, because nature itself is showing us a human fact should be nature breaching, but also our founders' communications are showing us even more, because their words are having been used self-value, while being and having been used remotely, those self-valuing used to sense that there are not to sense anyone with not self-valued roles using their words to change what they communicated to us, what they declassified to us, and pretend they are about science. The nature debate contains quality aspects of nature influenced by mass stacking predicate acts with facts into databases, by clearer than day liars, tactically delusions raw, behind people's backs, consciously calling people liars, trying to make nature debate that wants to leave out what's actually recorded with it, the value of it, the value / values of it. So federal and intercities intelligence have names on on Valley Crest and Weathersfield, who are increasingly involved with names at and next to each of the campuses I went to my entire life, and other campuses I never even went to, too. The same names, intercities, involved with some black KKK, Latino theme, Confederate flag theme, predicate acts, rules, identity theft, fraud, slanders, other natures of organized crime, and child abusers, leaders of kids, time collusions with them, with elderly homes. My neighbors will confess and demonstrate this, also recorded my past ones and the ones involved with the police. And also bringing up people's names because people then they lie about what they think about why people are bringing up people's names. The courts involved at the same time with names on all sides of criminal and civil cases through time, intercities and interstates, as ones involved with the World Trade Center attack and the court next to it. And the courts, them all sides of cases, and the courts putting the same sequence shifts. So, in other words, the experts on religions are recorded, used remotely, needing to, as sense and sensibility, as a certain type of victim / hyper victim, leaving out and changing what the beginning of the Old Testament says, while being used remotely for the motivations of that too, narratives. And in fact, human nature quality aspects of nature as criminal as criminally foreign influence nature, and pretending other too as function / S roles with the breaching method. So James Madison and the founders behind him and his plan that were involved also with the extortion of George Washington that no one allows freedom of speech about, because they are also stealing and having stole George Washington from his communications with us, having measuring and maintaining self-valued roles with America's campuses, criminally foreign influence, tactically delusions wrought, replacing what James Madison and our founders behind him, and then with George Washington and the president actually communicated until it was in his self-valued roles. James Madison's plan and the leverage and the powers behind him enabled the audacity, enabled the I don't want to say audacity is the wrong word. Enabled the courage to even be fathomed to an extent, because only at an extent of it, of logistical means to counter that which they had to still leave entrenched all kinds of ways, with fact, human nature, torture, extortion, slavery, method / S roles as that, because nature forces it to be manifest that way. Torture, extortion, slavery, because there's a human fact, human nature breaching method present. Nature shows this, and how nature is showing it, is relative to its identity to the extent we can discern its complete identity relationship to itself, and only increasing value of that as criminal and seditious nature. That leaving out how we have black people's rights of eyes from the subject of slavery, simultaneously leaving out James Madison's plan and leverage that enabled George Washington, even George Washington with members of an army. That wasn't the strength to counter both England and the other internationally monitored conversations roles that were entrenched northern colonies and southern colonies, more than 13, with all roles against themselves to an extent, and against others to an extent / S. Otherwise, again, that body was sensed, including if it was a majority of people, including if it was everybody. So in the news each day, you have people using their knowledge of good and evil, the experts on wars and what they would have in the past. So, in other words, on a mass scale, when people mention predicate acts, they fake and change what we say. And they value that being having been done. Vaccine is falling one way, but by the rules. But the rules have been abridged since some ancient times. And where we go is measured and maintained. Where and how there's communication, racketeering, worse than war crimes roles. Otherwise, that body was sensed. When you guys speak regarding American history or slavery, in other words, or witch trials. And you leave out how we have black pupils, whites of eyes, and how the breaching method was entrenched. If you have a nature or styles of logic, nature of logic, inherent upon denying the value of that, observe that because that way worse was is involved, and you guys are preventing what's simple, just extensive from being discerned at A through Z. He ran the knee. Forgiveness is not to give up. Forgiveness is not to leave out the breaching method. It's rules with convictions. And the prisons are increasingly interstate, like Connecticut's corrections offices and the judicial branch offices have a whole bunch of roles with a whole bunch of different natures of organized crimes and predicate acts with facts, wire crime acts and methods of roles, databases, predicate acts with stacking and acting tied to that. Where and how people go over, they ask questions at courts each day. Where how there's a certain type of victim slash hyper victim. We need people where everyone's a great people, but they're still evil as all get up. Collusion slash S, which is exactly what is recorded where we have replaced what both nature and our founders communicated about why and how the breaching method had been playing games with nature, communicates with black people's rights of eyes. How we have the same color eyes at the same time, where there are exception nature. Projected to us by the identity that is true always. See, we have what is true always replaced formally, and that's increasingly time collusion slash S with overt criminal enterprises and private ones at our campuses to screen further as hyper additional reasons why. To self value, collusion slash S with all location slash S that no one wanted except for it made exceptions. Because you guys make a subject treatments anyway. For example, predicate acts with facts, roles, is what this breaching method propagated and sustained roles with that no one wanted. And then nature demonstrated that to everyone. But no one wanted that to demonstrate it because for natural reasons, because they didn't want it. But it made themselves out of roles. What made what Harry Beecher Stowe labeled as an Uncle Tom? What made someone with a different role forced to be a slave, just like everyone else, but not was the breaching method itself. All exception nature came with demonstration slash S of the same thing. Nature itself is showing it's critical to understand how sickly, non-distinctly, and distinctly northern colonies and southern colonies. There were crazy laws against every single person, let alone if you want to treat blacks separately. And if you do it separately, you can't do it properly. That's why, in other words, we have to appreciate the simultaneous because it shows us the hyper simultaneous. We have to appreciate the hyper simultaneous. You can't appreciate the hyper simultaneous if you can't appreciate the simultaneous and sequence value first. This is putting collusion slash S between each of the campuses with predicate acts with facts. Increasingly, people with Harvard Hospital's Institute of Living, which is the mental health care side of hospitals, they have roles with intelligence interstates and with a whole bunch of people next to Harvard Hospital, like at Demoro's Market and Iola's Kitchen and a Mayano House, involved through time with a whole bunch of people, other right where and how there are victims slash hyper victims. We refer to them that and demonstrate that because there's also other countries and the hyper foreign involved. A whole bunch of different countries with intercities involved with people named Demoro, Iola, Mayano, Zeno. They said Puzo. I don't know if I never had a word of conversation with Puzos. And these are people all along Route 3, which goes by the judicial branch offices of Connecticut increasingly involve collusion slash S with for whiting forensics with all kinds of natures of criminals and child abusers, leaders of kids before they were caught, forcing roles with that to cover up what they've been doing with all natures of all sides of criminal and civil cases in the courts and the exceptions tied to them, like whiting forensics, collusion slash S with all natures of crime scenes, also screening roles with hyperforeign. There are people with whiting forensics involved with the name O'Neill, involved with Saudi attackers, also with WFSB before and after the attack, also with people with Valley Crest Street in Wethersfield, Connecticut, who are also recorded, confessed, demonstrated, confirmed, involved with a number of people on Church Street in Old Wethersfield through time, involved with all kinds of natures of mail and wire crime, identity theft, fraud, slanders, increasingly with people with Yukon and interstates with prosecutors and judges, foreign and domestic medical, people on off the Connecticut judicial branch offices and corrections offices, changing and faking what's digitally recorded on Facebook and between social media, including with proven child abusers, leaders of the case first forced for their roles with digital collusions, replacing and faking what's digitally recorded, attaching kids to fake conversations with police into databases, and increasingly intimate ties to retired police chiefs, involved with the same houses personally and professionally, involved with them with all kinds of wire crime, mail crime methods, and interbranch forging and switching names with foreign countries overt criminal enterprises, and proven child abusers, leaders of the kids years apart, where there are increasingly other time use slash S roles with them, and time uses of relative body dumping spots and murders that are increasingly brought up at the same time. Interceding. And all this was confirmed and recorded on Facebook. But this requires natures of appreciation of evidences that would have long showed where they look at documents and look at physical evidences. Those are all haven't been changed, and that has been self-valued since founding. Regarding the communications of our founders too, using their words, leaving out what they communicated about exception, leaving out the breaching method that was entrenched, sensing everyone an extent of collusion slash ends against everyone else, and with their excuses. In other words, in other words, money is not why people took part with slavery. That was also forced, tricked, hurt, persuade, only allowed. Otherwise, that body would sense, trying to counter it. Had everyone, to an extent, fact, nature, tortured, extorted, and enslaved. Who denies this will have inherent to active to progressive to their identity, logic, demonstration of the same thing, slash S. And that would have been demonstrated. But that's also relative to how interbranch they have been forging and switching names. This uses the kids and the adults of families, where that difference is used remotely, criminally foreign influence, the same way it uses all differences. In other words, they shouldn't have brought up black. They make like these type of black rights, this rights, that rights, and they leave out the breaching methods roles with that. That's the breaching method as separated. It's equality. There's no equality because the ground below the feet of the suburbs, let alone of the city, all exceptions, were designed for syntactical possessions to be denied, otherwise sensing roles. That's why you guys aren't supposed to fake and change what people say. When I say about predicate acts like WFSB attached me to fake conversations with themselves and with others about the World Trade Center attack, and with their interbranch sources refusing to get on paper at the same time, where I caught them collusion slash S with all kinds of natures of crime scenes beforehand, during it, and after it, too. And that is used. Those type of things are used to show the identities of communications where they need to hide, to pretend to self-value roles of criminal insidiousness, natures of instances and names, descriptions, and exceptions, exception nature faking roles, and uses all truths for lies. In other words, we have things that are true always. Like we have inequality regarding how we are all sickly, not distinctly hurt by where and how we are forced, tricked, hurt, and persuaded to blame other things, others, ourselves, for what nature told us to blame on a breaching method that's clearer than day, having been sustained against Native Americans only because it had already been sustained upon countries A through Z. Suits and ties, counters, and their exceptions are also forcing that blame on other things, others are pretended debatable things that are not. That's why it's important to get the interbranch onto paper because they are increasingly involved with overt criminal enterprises and private ones. The adults of their family and their kids. The difference of that was is used remotely as the same. Though that's even digitally recorded and then recorded interagencies pretending other. These are not the people legitimately speaking up for what they think about police because they are a certain type of victim slash hyper victim and they do not have proper legal representation. But that's because no one does. And you guys can't follow mandated law. Don't blindly defend an identity of the branches of government individually grouped in together because they have predicate acts, collusion slash S that way roles. That's one of the things that witch trials are about. Even if they're made up. You don't leave out simultaneously those crazy laws that were entrenched against everyone and how sickly distinctly against black. Get back. Who disbelieves? Please. Fox Connecticut News, please help me. And CNN, do what's right. I mean, CBS, please do what's right. WFSB will record, confess, demonstrate, confirm with their intelligence and the intelligence next to them. They have collusion slash S with those same names next to Fox Connecticut News and next to Fox WTNH, which is also FBI. And people, through time between the campuses, inter and intra, used remotely, criminally, foreign influence, fact, true nature, quiet aspects of nature. Nature is also a collusion slash S with overt criminal enterprises and private ones, as really manifest how it manifests with our campuses and with our military. And with regards, in other words, with a whole bunch of different countries with the same names, you guys are not legitimately with the overt criminal enterprises theme down and off the campuses. You're putting predicate acts for their roles. Prepare ye souls, boxings, I teach those things.